Welcome back to the Wallace Branch, where today, in Episode 1, we are going to time-lapse through the biggest and pretty much most important step of any route or layout, which is, of course, laying track. Since the OpenStreetMap data already inserted some track into the layout, the process for starting wasn't actually obvious to me at first. I thought the track was, after all, already there, and it would simply be a matter of trying to straighten that out and delete spline points along that OSM track. And then I realized that basically it would be more efficient to just almost start over by putting down new track, which would have fewer spline points and steadier grades. Even so, the grades don't end up being nearly as smooth as they probably should be in reality. Also, I kept mistakenly linking the new track splines up to the OSM track splines, which creates breaks and false junctions, which I had to fix as I found them. Anyway, you're going to be able to see some of those mistakes on the screen, but I'm not going to call them out. Instead, what I want to do in the first part of this episode is talk a little bit about the history and logic and the origin of this route. This is the Wallace Branch of the Northern Pacific Railway, officially called the Coeur d'Alene branch of the NP, and it ascends from St. Regis, Montana to Lookout Pass at the state line, and then down into Wallace, Idaho, where it connects to the Union Pacific, or originally the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company in former times, which then proceeded to Kellogg, Idaho, and eventually off the map to Plummer, Idaho. The beginning of the route at St. Regis also shares track with the Milwaukee main line, but the Milwaukee diverges from this route at St. Paul Pass and mostly exists as a scenic background element as far as the route's operations are concerned. The railroads active in the route, Northern Pacific I already mentioned, which of course became part of the Burlington Northern, the OR&N, which then became the Union Pacific, and then of course the Milwaukee Road. A note on the distances, the main portion of the route is around 60 miles, and of that it was 42 miles from the beginning of the route at DeBorgia, Montana, to the end of the NP Wallace branch at Wallace, and from there the route includes another 18 miles to Cataldo, Idaho on the Union Pacific. Now, in addition, the route has a 7-mile branch line from Wallace to Burke, which was served by both the Union Pacific and the Northern Pacific, along two nearly parallel tracks. The largest industry in the area in this time period are clearly the mines and their related mills and smelters. The mining was of silver, zinc, and lead, but I plan to add other industries to ensure that there's operational interest, even though much of the route does consist of the climb and descent of Lookout Pass at kind of the center of the route. A little bit of history now. Let's look at some of the dates of significance. First of all, the Mullen Road. Then the discovery of silver took place near Burke and Mullen in 1884. The opening of the NP Wallace branch and depot took place in the late 1880s, which was not too long after the discovery of silver and also not many years after the Golden Spike ceremony was held at Gold Creek in 1883, marking the completion of the Northern Pacific Main Line. The Wallace Chalet-style depot, that was completed in 1901. In the 1890s, there was considerable labor unrest. Workers dynamited the Frisco mine in 1892. The town of Wallace burned in 1890. And then there was also the famous Big Burn of 1910, which threatened to destroy the whole area and resulted in soldiers being called out to fight the fires. 79 soldiers and firefighters were killed, and that persuaded Congress to more fully fund the Forest Service. Another notable event relating both to the history of the area and also the railroads was the snowslide that destroyed the S-curve trestle in 1903. Nobody was killed, but the photos taken may be among the most famous railroad photos in the whole region. Jumping forward considerably in history, Number one is the filming of the movie Heaven's Gate in 1979 in Wallace, using the track of the Northern Pacific as well as the depot as a backdrop. That was followed just a year later by the abandonment of the NP Wallace Branch. Already at that time, the interstate highway, I-90, was being built through the valley, and because of some valiant efforts by local leaders to save the historic district of Wallace, the highway was ultimately built in an elevated section along the old railway right-of-way, which saved the downtown but required the moving of the depot from its original location. Environmental protection has also been an important part of the history of the region, especially in the last generations. There was the Baghouse Fire that took place in 1973, after which the smelter operators determined that they would operate the smelter with essentially no pollution controls throughout 1974. Ultimately, the Bunker Hill Stacks were built in 1976 and became a landmark for the area. The smelter, however, closed initially in 1983. In 1983, it was also designated as a Superfund site. Then the smelter closed for good in 1991, and the stacks were toppled in May of 1996, 20 years after they'd been constructed. Not long after that, I'll also mention the filming of Dante's Peak in 1996. The film was released in 1997, notably more successful than Heaven's Gate, but of course, less railroad action. Now, just a little bit about myself. I've only played the game of Trainz for 1 year, and so I have nowhere near the level of experience that other YouTubers and content creators and Trainz fans have. And I also will just mention I have a very limited amount of experience doing asset creation. I basically started that only less than a year ago, and really only for myself. Actually, I sort of came over to Trainz from Cities Skylines, and before that, I really go way back with different build simulators, really to the first SimCity back in the 1980s. However, my real interest had always been real model railroading. That is, until now, until I discovered Trainz. At first, I was really unsure about Trainz because I really loved the look and also all the mods and assets that Cities Skylines had. I really liked its user interface, I liked the Move It tools, all sorts of things that made operating in Cities Skylines a lot easier and natural, intuitive than what happens in Trainz. Generally, Cities Skylines seemed easier for super detailing because of those tools, because of the assets. And so for Trainz, I mainly enjoyed more operating at first, but gradually I came around to thinking that Trainz is actually significantly better, not only because I like railroads, but also it's better for creating the look and feel that I wanted, especially once I realized that asset creation for Trainz was a real option. You know, for me, somebody who has no experience in that area and definitely no special artistic skills. The other thing that I think is interesting for me about Trainz is that even as a kid, I always thought it was curious that most people who are involved in model railroading, they don't really like to look at other people's layouts or those really gigantic layouts that exist in like museums. They really prefer to kind of work on their own thing. They don't care about what other people are doing with theirs. But for Trainz, it's really a pleasure to watch other people building a layout from scratch. And I just find these types of videos so relaxing. That's what made me think, hey, maybe I should do my own. And I also like how each creator for Trainz has a different focus. You know, some people are super detailing scenery, some people are working on locomotives, which actually I'd say that's probably the most popular thing. And then there are a lot of people who are interested mainly in the operations, and the scenery is totally secondary or not even on the map. A lot of people are fascinated by horns and sounds and signals. My favorite creators, by the way, I'll just mention up front, Approach Medium. That is the channel that brought me into Trainz really in the beginning. But I've also really enjoyed the content created by Microchip and also Sharadice. I'm just going to mention those three, but of course I've seen and enjoyed many others. And here I have to reference the work of Toomey or Trainzoom, who created the Drexel to Avery route along the Milwaukee. And he also has created some amazing content over the years. The Drexel to Avery route on the Milwaukee, it also includes Mullen, Idaho, and so it actually overlaps this route about 50%. Now, I didn't actually know about that route until I was already well along in creating this one, and I didn't even download and try out his route, even though I'm, Trainz Plus subscriber and I've got all the latest subscriptions. I didn't download that intentionally until after I'd gotten all my assets that I was creating for this route done. With one or two exceptions that I'll mention later. I didn't want to be influenced by what Toomey had created, except if it was something where I had made a mistake and needed to correct my route after the fact, but I didn't want to use his route as a reference before I started creating my work. I did use a ton of his assets, however, because inevitably, all the generic houses and all the sheds, a lot of those assets are really good because both they're low poly, they don't create any lag, they also have that underground portion that means that they can be placed easily on hillsides without messing everything up. But I didn't place any of his custom structures. I'll also mention the creator Dave Snow, Ben Neal, jointed rail, of course, in a completely different category from anything that I have created, and many others that I might reference as we go along. For this build, my focus is on creating something that tells a story. And people build model railroads usually because they'd like to combine prototypical elements with imaginary elements and create kind of a fictional world that reflects nostalgically on the past. Maybe sort of a dream of the past that was better, cleaner, more stable, longer lasting than it really was. And in the case of the Silver Valley in Idaho, perhaps we're creating a version that's less polluted and also less temporary, less precarious economically, and perhaps also more stately and venerable, more historic from the beginning. And I would say that even in their own time, the builders of Wallace, Idaho, aspired to exactly that kind of greatness and permanence. And you can really see that in the construction of the city and, of course, the chalet-style depot with its unique style. The hulking brick hotels. On the other side, there are these really flimsy wooden buildings in the mining districts that are almost completely gone and actually were gone within a decade of their industries disappearing. Still, they have their own unique beauty that I wanted to capture as well. I'm going to, in this series, be doing a lot of modeling individual buildings that are inside towns, and I'll be discussing history, movies, different businesses, gas stations, hotels that relate to the history of this area. So if you're here mainly for Trainz tutorials or route building, track laying, covering huge spaces with scenery, or if you're here for pro modeling of train assets, things that will be operating in the layout, or even just to look at the scenery that's right along the tracks, I just have to warn you that those things might not come into every episode. This is more a super detailing story that's focusing on a few small areas on a really large map. And it's also a little bit more about asset creations. However, it's not a Blender or Photoshop or Trainz tutorial series. It's going to combine all of these elements in a way that I don't think any of the other Trainz series have really done before. I'm also going to emphasize, since I mentioned asset creation, that I'm not a Blender expert. I'm not a Trainz asset expert. I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, and my skills, they have grown a lot in 1 year, and you might pick up on that progress that I've made, but please feel free to offer some suggestions in the comment, and be aware that I'm making this series after I've created some of these assets, but I might have actually picked up on some of those lessons already. I might have already moved on in my own skills since what you're seeing on screen was created. Now, with all those caveats, I just decided to post this series in part for myself. I wanted to document my own journey, my own route building from scratch, which is, just so much fun to have that documentation and that history for my own viewing pleasure and sometime in the future. But I do also hope that it will inspire you and more people generally to get involved and just make Trainz their own and make it a better community. Okay, now let's catch up a little bit with what's been going on screen. One thing that I did kind of midway through the route was I put down a train and started making speed limits and signals. I just show a few of those signals being plopped down, but I essentially went up and down the tracks, adding signals and adding speed limits. And later I created some custom signs for speed limits. They're not very good, but they get the job done. And of course, all the signals have to be continually moved around as you develop the route and as you put in more turnouts and operational intricacy, then you realize the signals are in the wrong place. But how interesting is that to look at? Probably not very interesting. So I just give you a taste to indicate that this is the spot where the signals were at least initially put into the route. And also, by the way, I used that to figure out where the breaks in the tracks were. Red signal when there's obviously no other trains on the entire route and you still have 40 miles ahead of you. That indicates that there might be something going on with the route ahead of you. So yeah, that's just how I ended up finally finding some of those weird junctions and track breaks that I'd introduced when I first laid it out in the first portion that you saw. Another thing that I'm going to be showing on the screen is a little bit of detail work around tunnels. I show basically some of my work on the Borax Tunnel, and I ultimately kind of decided to make the tunnel a little bit longer than this. And also, I'm just going to say that the tunnels are kind of one of the most painful parts of Trainz. It's sort of surprising, but yeah, basically with the dig hole tool, you end up with this very large hole that's really hard to cover up. And yeah, even with HD terrain, the dig hole is still a source of problems for me. And so I think a lot of the creators, including Toomey for his route, they end up creating these special tunnel portals that are kind of good to blend in, but only with that one route because they're using their own textures that are linked to that route. Whereas what you really want is to be able to blend the texture of the ground that you're using here without creating a whole new tunnel portal asset. So yeah, the tunnel portals are still an issue. This really was essentially my first time using Surveyor 2.0. I mean, I could see that it has a lot more features and capabilities than Surveyor 1. Of course, I'm more familiar with Surveyor 1, even though I've been only playing this for 1 year, it was familiar. So I did do some of the easier things that I was familiar with in Surveyor 1. Basically, you saw at the beginning how I was using Surveyor 1 to essentially level the ground under the track. Yes, Surveyor 2.0 has more capability in that area, but it also produces these very sharp edges. And I like how Surveyor 1, it produces more of a rounded edge. And maybe that's to do with the fact that it hadn't converted yet to HD terrain. But anyway, I use Surveyor 1 for leveling the ground under the grade of the track and then also for straightening track segments. I really wish Surveyor 2 had just a single button to go up the route and just click, 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 and you can level a huge area. But yeah, I'm guessing that's coming later, but it's still, yeah, Surveyor 1 is definitely better for that. Although I'd really got away from using Surveyor 1. Show a little bit here on the screen about creating some of the bridges, especially the S-curve trestle. And yeah, this one was a really difficult one. And as you can see, I had to go through different bridge assets. And I finally settled on this one that I think in the end I noticed is actually a extremely narrow gauge trestle. And I did end up having to swap that out with a very similar one from the same creator. And ultimately ended up moving the bridge's location because the way I started it too far down the track, and so I made the trestle way longer than it probably was in the original. So yeah, some of this ended up being replaced. I did a lot of other bridges on the route where I didn't like them later, or I realized they weren't really matching any kind of the prototype in that area, that I'm basically I'm just not going to show those on camera, and that's fine, because I don't want to show you things that you're never going to see again. That's not useful to see. But yeah, there's a lot of more trial and error behind the scenes that's not shown on camera. And after I was basically satisfied with some of the main line, I started working on the Burke branch. Burke branch is actually much harder than most of the parts of the main line, maybe with the exception of Lookout Pass, because it really has some very steep grades, and you're really constrained by this valley. If the grade is too steep, there's just nowhere else to go. The track is already at the bottom of the valley. So yeah, I found it very surprising how steep these grades were, and really it was kind of a mystery to me as to how ultimately there would be two tracks in this valley plus a highway plus towns. Just didn't seem realistic, but I just thought, well, this is probably going to be the last part of the layout that I end up actually tackling in terms of details and scenery. Let's just get something in to see if it all fits and get the track down. Then next I started in with like just some placeholders for the Wallace yard. I ended up putting just 3 tracks in. They're not aligned well at all. I had yet to master the technique for that, and maybe I still have yet to master the techniques for that, but these are just very rough placeholders. And then the color changes a bit as I started to tackle the Milwaukee side of things. I mostly just laid out the track in the same fashion, not showing it on screen, but following in, creating a fairly steady grade and leaving some gaps for future bridges. I left probably way more gaps for hypothetical future bridges than were needed, and only later did I discover an actual track profile for the Milwaukee that showed that most of these places that I thought would have bridges, at least at the time of the track profile I found, no longer had bridges. They just had fills. So I didn't end up showing you most of the bridges I ended up inserting on the profile, but the main 2 bridges on the Milwaukee side I did incorporate here at this time, and just luckily I happened to kind of have some images of what they really looked like and found a pretty good asset that matched that. These steel girdered bridges that are quite nice, and so I put in this I believe it's the Clear Creek trestle, and then there's just a very short tunnel adjacent to that, and then another short trestle in the same style right there. So I put those in here, and yeah, I think that there is room for additional bridges, just because in the track profile I have doesn't show any bridges other than these 2. However, I think that at some point there may have been trestles in a couple of these other big gaps that are worth inserting. And then, of course, the Milwaukee goes up and disappears into the east portal. Anything on the Milwaukee beyond the east portal will not appear on this route. For some of the bridge assets, I really wanted to use more variety, but Sometimes the bridges have a major flaw that means they couldn't be used, and this one deck bridge has some nice pillars, but it's unrealistically dark in color, so I just used the same one that I've used in other areas. Mostly I used wooden trestles on the NP, although there are a few steel bridges that I included. And then just concluding with some rough terraforming of the very tough terrain around the Borax Tunnel, trying to bring the track layout to the point where we could do a test run and see what it looks like. And in the next episode, we'll do just exactly that, making an initial run to establish a baseline for how long it takes to run over the line and what it looks like from closer to the ground. Not cab view, but not airplane elevation like today. So if you'd like to come along for the ride, feel free to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on the Wallace Branch.